Hi, everybody, and welcome. Jess, you can come and sit. It's okay. We're not that formal. So I'm very pleased to see a nice group today and to welcome you back to our second installment in our History Speaks series. And today we're so happy to have Jessica Carver with us. Jessica, I know Jessica because she goes to STU and I work at STU, and we've been working together with her thesis research. And so I'm really excited that she agreed to come here today and to present to you folks. Maybe it'll light that fire to just dot those I's and cross those T's. Jessica's graduating this year with her Bachelor of Arts from St. Thomas, and she's going to have an honors in history and a major in French. And this presentation is excerpted from her undergraduate thesis work. So Jessica's originally from Windsor, Nova Scotia. She's interested in researching 19th and 20th Canadian history, with particular topics including feminism, education, and tourism. She is a member of the Greater Fredericton Women's Institute and enjoys playing music, spending time with her pets, and reading about Canadian history. I also feel like you enjoy ducks.
Yes.
Yes.
Slightly.
So about Jess's presentation, the first Women's Institute in the Maritimes were founded in 1913 as a space for primarily rural women to meet, lend each other support, and enact change in their communities. On a local level, this looked like starting lunch programs at the community school, sewing clothes for families who were in need, and Women's Institutes also contributed to the volunteer landscape in a greater Canadian context. I feel like I don't want to give it all away. How about this? Her project is going to present the work of the Women's Institute of Scotch Village in Nova Scotia through their first 10 years. It's going to serve as a case study of the work of the Women's Institute in the Maritimes, and it will discuss themes such as World War I, education initiatives, and social welfare projects in the community. So take it away, Jess. We're so excited.
Well, thank you, Heather, for the lovely introduction. As she said, my name is Jessica, and this is most of my undergraduate thesis. So you could switch to the next slide, please. Hopefully. Okay, awesome. So this is me on the far right there. And for many summers, I have been working at the West Hants Historical Society, which is a group that seems fairly similar to the one here, but it's in my hometown of Windsor, Nova Scotia. So we're found in what used to be a church. That's on the left there. And that is part of why I was really interested in studying the history of that particular area for my undergraduate thesis work. And then all of the material that I have been using to do my research was from the museum. So they were very nice, and I had my own set of keys, and they let me go in at like 6 and 7 in the morning to go in and do my research before we opened at 9 for the public. Excellent. So why am I interested particularly in the Women's Institute? I'm from a rural background, so I wanted to study the history of people in rural communities in Nova Scotia. And I also was really interested in feminist history, so I wanted to study the history of women. And in particular, I was drawn to the Women's Institute because my great-grandmother was a member, and she passed away when I was about 7. So I do remember her a little bit, but she is in these photos here. So I don't know if you can tell, but I actually think she might be covered up by the zoom lens there, but also there and there in the corner. So that was my great grandmother. And I remember like kind of my grandparents and my parents, they were telling me stories about what you do with the Women's Institute in my area. So that's why I wanted to study this group in particular. And next slide, please. So for context, the Women's Institute in Canada was started in 1897 in Ontario.
Can you mute your mic? Something, we're getting feedback for something.
I'm trying to turn it on.
Okay.
So in 1897 in Ontario, there's a woman named Adelaide Hoodless, and she's on the left there. And unfortunately, her son passed away when he was quite young. He was about a year old. The exact kind of age differs depending on the source. but he drank milk that was supposedly like unsafe, and he passed away. And she was obviously quite upset about this. And so she wanted to create a group that would educate rural women so that something similar didn't happen to them. Because she felt that if she had someone tell her that milk wasn't safe to feed her baby, then he wouldn't have died. And so the group started then. The first branch was in Stony Creek, which was her community, and her house now is actually a museum that's run by the Women's Institute. So you can go visit, which is super cool. And the Women's Institutes then came to Nova Scotia in particular around 1911 from Dr. Melville Cumming, and that's him on the right. And he was the president of the Nova Scotia Agricultural College, and he was also the Secretary of Agriculture for Nova Scotia. And he traveled to Ontario and he saw the Women's Institutes, and he thought they were just, the best thing in the world. So he came back to Nova Scotia and he campaigned for the government, and he asked them to help create Women's Institutes in his own province. So 2 years later, in 1913, took a little bit to get going. The first branch was created in Pictou County in July. Next slide. So that is kind of context of the larger Women's Institutes in Nova Scotia. So you might be wondering why I picked in particular Scotch Village to talk about. So this is a screenshot of Google Maps, and this is where Scotch Village is found. So Windsor is right here, and that is the town that is in the area, population of about 3,000, but all of this area, the whole thing is just rural agricultural farmland, so very isolated. And Scotch Village was, I believe, the first branch that was made in the area. So they were created in September 1913. So just a few months after the first branch was made in Nova Scotia at all. That is really why I picked this area to focus on, because I think it is really interesting that they were kind of the first group in the area, so close after the group was created at all. And it's also the source material that I had access to. So next slide, please. So these are the minute books from the Scotch Village branch. And this is what I've been working through and reading to do all of my research and tell you all of this very cool stuff I'm about to. And they were all found at the museum that I mentioned earlier, just on the shelf. And they were the only ones that were that early. So that's why I will be talking about them. Next. So my thesis is kind of divided into 3 sections, which is based on the patterns that I noticed they did in their work. So I'll be talking about the First World War, education work, and also social welfare projects, which is just kind of everything they did to help the community that doesn't fit under education and war work. And so First World War started in 1914, and the Women's Institute started at the end of 1913. So they barely had their feet under them when they were suddenly kind of thrust into this world war that they were expected to contribute to. And so they did this in a few different ways. They knitted socks, like you can see on the right, and they also contributed to Red Cross quilts. So pretty much for the entire 4 years of the war, they were quilting and knitting and doing this kind of homemaking work as their way to contribute. So they were really using the skills that they already had as women in the home at this time to contribute to volunteer work across the world, because they were sending these quilts and socks to Europe and those that were in need. And they also fundraised to get all of the material that they needed for these quilts and socks. And they did this by having socials, which I think is particularly interesting, because not only were the socials a way to raise money to buy the supplies, but they also provided a space for people of the community to gather in a time of crisis, really, and to get together. And they were fairly casual events by the sounds of it. They had like ice cream socials and bean suppers and these kind of casual ways for people to meet and chat and get together, but also for a way for regular people that aren't involved in these like aid organizations to contribute to the war in some way. They also sold Allied for the Right buttons, which I think are very, very interesting. And these photos of this button in particular came from an online museum based out of Vancouver. The buttons are from Ontario, from a lady who was part of the Women's Institute there. So while the women in Scotch Village were selling these particular buttons, women all around Canada were also selling these particular buttons. So the women of Scotch Village are kind of following these patterns that are appearing all over Canada. And I think they're very interesting because they definitely have nods like British pride, and that idea that they're really doing the right thing in the war, which is super cool, I think. And I also wanted to mention very briefly that this idea of being like really involved in the war overseas, and at the end of each meeting, they would sing to adjourn the meeting. And most of the time they would sing God Save the King. But the one meeting where they didn't was after the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and they sang God Be With Us Till We Meet Again, which, I mean, I can't say for sure that that's why they changed their song, but I think there might be a connection there, which is really interesting. And the women of Scotch Village were also really involved with aid projects following the Halifax explosion. In particular, they were invested in creating aid boxes for children, which is a theme that appears a lot throughout my research. Is they were really, really interested and invested in the well-being of children, both in their community and outside of it, across the province, across the world. And they got together and they were sewing the clothes themselves, put in the boxes, and they were donating their own money instead of fundraising, because this was a immediate crisis and people needed help. So they were taking money from their own pockets and going to the store to buy supplies and sewing the clothes in the hall and then sending them in boxes to Halifax, which is really sweet, and really shows, I think, how much they care about the well-being of the children around in their community. And their involvement with the war didn't end when the war ended, which I also think is very interesting. So the Women's Institute of Scotch Village was one of the first groups to sell poppies in 1921 when they were beginning to be introduced. So there's a photo of one of the poppies they might have been selling. And they also were holding receptions and picnics for soldiers when they came home from the war, to get everyone together and get the community to support their men that had gone overseas. And they also continued to make donations to other aid charities that were having, again, particularly children who were affected by the war. They sent quite a large donation to a group in France for children that were orphaned because of the war. And so again, just kind of this idea that they really care about the children that are around and want to see them succeed and do well. Yeah. Next. The Women's Institutes were also very concerned with education. So I've kind of divided the way they worked with education into two categories or themes. So they were worried with the education of the women that were part of the group. And they were also worried about providing education to people outside of the group. So, for example, they had a section of the meeting that was called the question box period, which was just an opportunity for people or women who are members who had questions that they wanted to ask, like, I need a recipe for fudge, or I need a recipe for pickled onions, or I don't know how to do this crochet stitch, could you show me? And so the meetings were a place for these women to get together and share their knowledge with each other and educate each other. They also were a place where women could bring information that they gathered in the form of pamphlets, brochures, bulletins, and this became very apparent following the war when public health and the Spanish flu were starting to really kind of gain traction. So women would often come in like 1920-ish with public health bulletins, and they'd read like, oh, this is what you should do when you have a cough. You should wash your hands, cover your mouth, and then like share that information with the other women in the group, which is really interesting. The meetings were also a space for women to apply to go to courses at the technical college, because the technical college would send letters to the branch and ask them to read them at each meeting and provide information to the women if they want to apply to go to like a dressmaking course at the college in Halifax. And they also offered a space for women to apply to do a mail to home course, which is really interesting. So that's what is on the left. It's kind of the technical college in Halifax offered in-person classes, but they also offered like mail courses. So they would send you the information and then you would complete it and do the coursework and learn something. And that's how they kind of encourage the education of their own members. Oh, I had all that written down on note and I didn't even read it. Yes, next slide, please. So this is just a schoolhouse that I found on the internet. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo of the schoolhouse at Scotch Village, even though I tried for many hours to find one. But the women of Scotch Village were very, very passionate about the education of the children in their community. So they really wanted to make sure that these kids that were growing up, they had a good place to learn. So they maintained the schoolhouse, they built a fence, they put up a flag post, they also tore down the fence when it was no longer good, sold the materials and built another fence. And they like bought flower gardens to put in the yard and a lunch closet for the kids and all of this stuff. Keep the school a healthy spot and a safe spot for the kids to go. And not only that, they also hired a school teacher themselves. So it's very easy to see that they were really, really passionate and invested in the education of the children in their community. And a lot of women's institutes, it's okay. A lot of women's institutes kind of later on than I've studied started hot lunch programs in their school. So I'm very interested to see if maybe this branch did the same thing if I continue my research, hopefully down the road. Awesome. So the, actually, could you go back to the last one? Did it go too early? So not only were the women of Scotch Village invested in the education of children, they also wanted to educate adults in the community. And they did this in various ways. So in 1917, they started a carpentry course for the men of the community, which I think is particularly interesting because it's for men, and this is a group for women, and most of the time the women were concerned with other women and children. And so this is really interesting, and I think it shows that when women are empowered in these roles, everyone benefits, including the men are their peers. So they found a teacher to teach the course, they found a space to do it, they bought all of the supplies, which, is fairly expensive for a nonprofit group or a community aid group. And apparently it was fairly successful based on the minutes that I saw. They also did a sewing class for young girls, and this happened for 3 or 4 years, I think. Every summer, once school would get out, the girls would go once a week to a home of one of the women in the group, and they were the teachers themselves. So they would teach these girls to sew. Again, they bought all the supplies, let the girls keep it at the end. Very, very sweet. And they also had a nursing. So this was in 1920, kind of the same time that they're starting to really get invested in like public health bulletins. I'm a little bit worried about the flu. Seems like there were a couple meetings that were canceled because of it. But I don't really have any information because it just has in the minutes, meeting canceled due to the flu. And then they move on to the next one, unfortunately. But yeah, so they were very, very, very invested in the education of their community. The women were also interested in just kind of bettering their community in general, not just related to the war and related to education. So in my thesis, I've called this the social welfare chapter, and it just kind of encompasses everything that they did to help out their community, and that doesn't fit in one of the other categories. And I have thought about it as like rings. So the first ring is they're helping people that are part of the branch themselves. The next ring is they're helping people that are like individuals and families in the community, and they're helping directly. The third ring is they're helping their community kind of generally. And then the last one is they're helping people across the province, across the country, across the world. So for example, in the first ring, if someone's husband has passed away, they'll send a sympathy card. Or when one of the members gets married, they buy her a lamp to put in her parlor as a token of their affection, I think is what they call it, which is very sweet. So they're helping people out that are part of their own group. The second ring, they're helping out individuals directly. So for example, their friend of one of the members, her name's Ira Parker, and she's going deaf, and they raise money to buy her an ear trumpet, which is a very early like hearing aid. And I hadn't seen a photo of one until I was doing this presentation, and I was quite taken aback. But they also help if there's a family who's in need, like their house is burnt down, they'll sew them clothes and this kind of thing. So helping people directly that are in the community. They will also help their community kind of generally. Please. And they'll do this in a few ways. One time they raised money to build a sidewalk, and they're also really invested in the upkeep of their community hall, buying stairs and curtains and dishes and all this sort of thing. They also organized for a small fair or an exhibition to be held in Scotch Village every year. And these photos are from the exhibition in Windsor, which is the town that's really close by. And Windsor has the oldest continually run agricultural fair in North America. So the fair and exhibition kind of community there is very strong. It's a very important part of the culture. So the fact that these women of Scotch Village are, buying seeds for the kids in the spring so they can plant them to have flowers to exhibit in the fall. And they're finding the judges and the prizes and organizing the dates. It all is very important because it is a big part of the culture there. And I also think it is very cool that they bought seeds for all of the school children. And it really ensures that no one is feeling left out. They wanted everyone to be able to participate no matter what their finances looked like, which is really nice. Again, shows how much they care about the kids around. They also contributed to social welfare on a provincial, national, and global level. So in 1918, they were involved, albeit perhaps begrudgingly, with the suffrage movement, and got a letter in kind of the spring of 1918 that asked if they would support the Women's Suffrage Committee. And that's really all the information it said. And in the minutes, they're like, oh no, like we have to ask the superintendent of the provincial body of Women's Institutes of Nova Scotia before we can make a decision. And then it takes a couple months and they're like, oh no, we should decide in September when there's more people here. And then they just kind of keep doesn't seem like they really want to vote on whether or not they want to support it. And then finally in October, they do the vote. And it passed with a 5-4 vote to support the suffrage movement. So I'm not quite sure what that means, but it's interesting to say the least. They were also involved with the School for the Blind that was in Halifax. They bought them sanitary drinking water. I don't know how they did that. I don't got them a water cooler or somehow were sending money to repair the school in a way that made the water more clean. But apparently they got clean water for the School for the Blind. They were also involved with a campaign to create a school for the feeble-minded in some sort of central part of Nova Scotia, like Truro, Halifax. Because this is at a time where people who are suffering from a mental disability are put in poorhouses, which are very poor conditions and not really suitable for people to live in. So they were campaigning to have a new building put somewhere so that people could go there instead. Now, as a bit of an aside, it's a little bit of a controversial opinion in the history department at STU to be really interested in Canadian history. A lot of people think it's boring. Well, a lot of students think it's really boring just because they grow up learning about Canadian history and it's here, right? They want something new, something different. I am the opposite. I think Canadian history is particularly exciting because it's here and it's really attainable. So I was trying to find visual sources or visual pieces to put in a presentation for you guys. And I was like, oh, I'll go on newspapers.com, which is like an online newspaper database, and see what I can find, see if anything pops up that might be cool. And when you use newspapers.com, you put in your search terms, and it highlights them on the newspaper. So when you see the like giant newspaper page, it takes you right to the part you want to look at. So my search term was Scotch Village, and it highlighted it. And then right beside Scotch Village, you can see this is what highlighted, was Sweets Corner, Miss Pearl Crim. And I was like, that's interesting, because my middle name is Pearl, and Pearl Cochrane was my great-great-grandmother, and I'm named after her. So I'm like sitting at the public library in Fredericton. I'm texting my mom. I'm like, do you think Pearl would have been in the Women's Institute? And she's like, well, not Scotch Village, but maybe in Sweets Corner. I was like, okay, interesting. Because we had no idea. And I wouldn't have known unless I was doing this research. And I just kind of happened to stumble across this newspaper article. So I know, like, because I'm also interested in like genealogy research, I had a bit of a particular interest in her just because I'm named after her. And she was also very interested in local history. She wrote a book about the history of our community. And that's a photo of her with my great-great-grandfather on his 100th birthday. Yeah. So that was just kind of a nice little anecdote that I wanted to share. Next slide, please. So what? The biggest question when you study history at school is, why are you bothering to study this? What does it matter? Why is it? So I, in my thesis, am suggesting that the Scotch Village Women's Institute could be a case study for the women's institutes in the Maritimes, because they are not very well studied, hardly at all. And I have limited resources. I'm an undergraduate student, so I only have 1 year, and I don't have like a lot of spare time or money or students helping me to do this research. So I'm suggesting that by studying this one small chunk of Women's Institute's history, that maybe it could be used to show that it's worth studying at all. And maybe other people could study Women's Institutes of Nova Scotia, of New Brunswick, and find patterns in my work and things that they relate to, which would be very, very cool. I also would like to show that the Women's Institutes kind of bettered their community, because it was a very unique group. There weren't a lot of groups at the time that were just a space for women to come together and do what they wanted. They got to decide what they thought was important and what they wanted to dedicate their time to. So they were really interested in the schoolhouse and the hall. They wanted to make sure children were doing okay and help children out, and it was a space for them to do that. And they also wanted to help each other out, and it was a space for them to do that, which is why it's important, because in such a rural community, you don't have a lot of spaces to do that. And I think that they really bettered their whole community through the empowerment of themselves as women, men, children, other women, the environment, maybe? Question mark? Yeah, and that's why it's important and why I'm talking to you about it today. Thanks. And thank you very much for having me. Are there any questions? Oh, yes. Okay.
Something. Small group of women that accomplished.
Oh, yeah.
Very broad. What's the membership? Like we had the one picture that showed quite a few people, and then we had only 9 people voting.
Yeah. And when they started, it was about like 9 people. And then it kind of like fluctuated. So they started just very few, 9, 10. By 1918, they did have like 20 or so members, but not a lot of them came to that meeting, interestingly enough. The average meeting attendance for that year was like 13 people. And there were very few that came to that one and the one before that.
What's the population of Scotia?
Oh my gosh, not very much, but I don't know exactly. Yeah.
I have a question about, so many communities have, small communities have
Mhm.
women's institute halls,
Mhm.
but, and many of them also have community halls.
Mhm.
And I understand, in my head, I guess, how it could happen that the community could come together to build a community hall.
Mhm.
Where did the resources come from or which women's institute groups to actually build buildings
Hmm,
for their halls?
that's a great question. I don't think there's a women's institute hall in Scotch Village, so I haven't looked into that very much.
Okay.
I imagine probably the same fundraising that they did for other projects, like socials, and they did like yard sales. And they had teas where people would come in and pay a little bit of money and get some tea and sweets and yeah, that,
Carpentry course.
yeah. That, yeah.
And to in New Brunswick, there's a major relationship between the Department of Agriculture and the institute.
Mhm.
So a lot of them in New Brunswick are funded through the Department of Agriculture.
Yeah.
That's one thing you must be out about Nova Scotia.
Yeah, they had one mention of they got a grant. And I was like, where is this grant coming from? I'm assuming it's from the Department of Agriculture, but they don't specify. And they don't mention anything else for the rest of the minutes. I'm like, that's,
Yeah.
A little
I don't
odd, but-
understand the relationship between the two.
Yeah.
vendors, so.
What is that?
Yeah, I know this is.
Well, the Department of Agriculture years ago used to have a Department of Home Economics.
mhm,
And that portion of someone that interacted with communities.
Mhm.
And, someone from the Department of Agriculture, the Home Economics branch, come up here to the community hall to show women how to make buttons out of the nuts to go down on the islands. Butternut, not butternut. Butternut. And show what is the butternut, make two holes. That's cool. And I have to tell you about the kind of sharing of information that came from Department of Agriculture. Now, I don't know, perhaps they came here and spoke to the Women's Institute. At the community hall. And shared those kinds of skills during a time with no money.
yeah, I think on my one card that I like switched, I meant to mention that they would also have demonstrations at meetings. So either a member that knows something, this happened a lot of canning. They had a lot of canning demonstrations. So a woman that was really like skilled at canning, she would show up to the meeting with her supplies and like show all the other women how to can. But they also had like professional home economic professionals come from the Department of Agriculture and give a demonstration on X subject. So I also think sometimes the women got to choose what subject they wanted, like they would mail back a preference. So they have one woman come and her topic is old things made new. So she shows up at the end of the meeting and they have their little their demonstration, and yeah, very, very interesting.
We have a question just from Jennifer. Did the women's group have anything to do with 4-H? She says, I was a member long ago and wondered when it started. And you are, you said you were quite involved in 4-H, so.
Yeah.
have A good perspective on this.
Yeah, I believe that 4-H developed from the Women's Institute in some ways. So I think that some of these courses that the women were doing, like the sewing class, this would kind of turn into after time, like the sewing club that would become a 4-H club, very gradually. That makes sense. But 4-H also would have developed from other groups. So not only the Women's Institute, there were other similar groups that would have like more of the men's groups. The Women's Institutes weren't involved in more of the men's subjects or projects like beef and things, the cat club. Yes. So the quick answer is yes. The long answer is sort of, I suppose. They definitely had an influence though.
There's probably a triangle between the Department
Yeah.
of Agriculture, 4-H, and Women's Institute. I don't
Yeah.
know where the power comes from.
Yeah. So I definitely remember reading that these like sewing groups and like the girls' classes that they would do, like those turned into the sewing clubs for the girls, because for a while 4-H was kind of separate. Like the girls would do some clubs and the guys would do like some other clubs. And then I guess after a while, they just kind of like all merged together.
Fairs.
Yeah, For sure.
Right.
yes.
For the woman in the station, one relation.
I think it was, good question.
Because in some communities, united as the.
Yeah. I understand it to be a group where like people from different churches could come together. And because the church groups, the women would get together in their own church, right? But the Women's Institute space for women for different churches to kind of get together and interact, which is why it kind of offers something new, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Mostly Protestant.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So everybody mostly.
Yeah.
We were from a Catholic community and we have the same group. So I guess every community had their own
Yeah. Yes.
days.
And who gets in first and who's like the
Fair.
first people
Yeah.
who like get the ball rolling. Which
The
influence.
next church you go to another community.
Yeah.
Like it was the way it was. We were- Yeah, so I think every community had their own.
Yeah, I
trouble
think
with
so.
it.
And I think there were also the offshoot groups specifically for those religions, like the
Mhm.
Catholic Women's League, and then you have the
Yeah.
IODE, and.
Yeah.
And so I think there was quite a disbursement of. I mean, if they had those.
Yeah.
Easy how we, honey, because there's so many groups out there looking for the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
They started quite early though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize how early the.
Yeah, I think it's also very interesting that they were, concerning their opinion on the right to vote, they were following like very proper and fairly strict parliamentary procedure in all of their meetings, even in like 1913, the very first ones are like, oh, gonna make a motion, this is our president, this is our financial report, all this stuff. But, they're even involved in politics at that point, right? Which is definitely, I don't know, it's something that's interesting to note at the very least. Again, not quite sure what it means, but yes,
Did they move out west as well as down east?
they did, I think. I'm pretty sure. Mhm. Yeah, the movement started in Ontario, but now it's all around the world even. It's very popular in the UK. Yeah. And there's actually, I joined the Women's Institute in Fredericton just because I was curious. I was like, oh, I'm reading all about this group. I might as well join one and see what it's like. And there's one lady that actually zooms in with a group that's in the UK because I think they're an entirely online women's institute. They're like based in the UK, but they do all of their meetings on Zoom and like anyone can join in if they want to. And it's really cool to see how this group that is very like agricultural, rural, homemaking base has kind of like evolved with the times too. A little bit outside of my time period that I'm studying, but also very cool.
So but it's still going on. They're still going on.
Yeah, they are.
What are your meetings?
The Fredericton Women's Institute, like what do you do, and
Oh,
do you see any similarities between the minutes that you're reading and
Oh,
what
yeah.
you're doing?
oh yeah, for sure. Well, for example, every month they buy yogurt to donate to a school that is in a more like poor part of Fredericton. And every month we spend money and donate the yogurt. And I'm like, this is exactly what they were doing in 1920. Yeah, and we follow like a very similar like parliamentary procedure kind of thing. We start the meeting with the Mary Stuart Collect, and with Oh Canada and God Save the King Now. And my first meeting was actually the first meeting after the Queen had died. And it was a big deal that they were singing God Save the King instead of God Save the Queen. And I was like, oh yeah. And we actually, at that meeting, we decided to send a congratulations letter to King Charles. And so this was in September, I suppose. And at our last meeting that I had at the beginning of April, we had actually just received a letter back from the royal palace, I guess, that was like, oh, thank you for your letter. I'm sure you can understand why I still want to get back to you. But we appreciate the thought. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so that was cool. And what else do we do? Yes.
Rural Quebec.
Oh,
Are there women's institutes in rural Quebec?
I don't know. I haven't really thought about that. What does Google say?
That Facebook,
Okay.
that women's institute. I don't know. So there's a Federation of Women Institutes in Canada. Is that the overarching?
Yes.
Okay. A lot of crochet patterns.
Oh,
For membership Monday, they featured the Women's Institutes of Quebec. They have their own newsletter. And they have a Facebook group as well. Well, they have a rally in Gaspé.
very cool.
Made pin cushions and took a walk to Piercy Rock. So, I mean, Gaspé is pretty rural.
Yeah.
I would say that they're around. Interesting.
Have you ever?
Oh, I haven't, but I would love to.
Yes.
I know, I thought it was so cool, and I wasn't even really hoping to like find a lot of information about it, but I just kind of Google imaged it one day and I was like, oh, like I'm writing about this thing, it would be cool to see what it looks like, right? And then I found one that was sold by another woman in a women's institute in Ontario, and I was like, wow, look at that, like that is so cool.
So when you bought that button, you paid for a pair of socks to be sent away?
I'm really not sure, I think you just got the button.
Yeah, I think it's a 3 buttons for a pair of socks.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, no,
Yeah.
I couldn't read it.
Yeah, so I think the idea was that by selling the button, the women would get some money and then to buy, yeah.
Japan was quite big. It almost looks like the size of the Allies was represented.
Germany.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was it.
Yeah, but yeah, you know, it was like another way for people in the community who weren't really like super involved with the war effort to help out a little bit, feel like they were doing. Something. Yeah, yeah. Oh, cool.
Thank you so much, Jessica. You did a
You're
great
welcome.
job.
Thank you for having me.
And